Hi, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. I'm really excited and happy to be here. So I'm going to kind of take a little bit of a zoom out. I think I'm probably best known for the report I did at RethinkX on the disruption of the cow, and I'm going to kind of take elements of that and think about how patterns of history can really inform the future, especially around kind of disruptive technologies. And we've heard a lot over the last couple of days about some really potentially disruptive technologies, but I really want to take you through a framework to think about and understand how that technology actually can be disruptive and the implications and choices beyond that, especially when it comes to biotech. So I'm going to start my presentation with something that biotech is going to result in over the next few years, and that's a real-life impact beyond medicine. And what does this going to mean? So there is a pivotal technology out there that means over the next 15 to 20 years, we're going to see a deepest, fastest, most consequential disruption to the way we produce protein of the last 10,000 years. And this is unfolding not because of ethics, but because of economics. It's inevitable, and it's going to have huge implications for materials, medicine, and beyond, and food systems, of course. And part of the reason for this is we're really in the midst of a multi-sector disruption. So I want to take a bit of a zoom out and think about these kind of technologies on the above. We've been talking a lot about technologies, things like robotics, AI, food tech, biotech, but they actually have impacts down into these kind of 5 foundational sectors that we defined at RethinkX. So transportation, food, information, energy, and materials. And I think it's really important to kind of take that step back a little bit, because at Deep Tech Atelier, we're really considering those first level of technologies, but understanding how they're actually going to go through and impact sectors is just as important. And they're not going to just impact one sector, right? A lot of these technologies really flow through into a lot of sectors. So then that in itself can be accelerating and kind of lead to further disruption. So what are these technologies? Well, we've identified a few at RethinkX, and just to be aware that a lot of these are over the next decade or so, and many we've heard about here today: 3D printing, nanosatellites, robotics were mentioned a lot yesterday. But what I'm going to focus on is something we call precision biology, but is really biotech, I would say. And we kind of define this as the idea of the convergence of other technologies, allowing us, and what does it allow us to do? Things faster than ever before, more efficiently than ever before. And that comes with profound possibilities. And I think this is something that's really important when we think about a lot of RethinkX, which is the idea that understanding that possibility space that opens up from disruptive technologies. And this may seem fairly obvious to a room full of kind of deep thinkers about deep tech, but understanding that is really vital when it comes to think about why technology can be really successful. So I'm going to talk about 3 things. The first bit is the longest, the other 2 are a bit shorter, so don't worry. First of all, what is disruption? Even defining it is quite an emotive word, and then kind of talking about how we apply that to food, and then a little bit about implications and next steps for biotech. And we define disruption as when a new product, business, or service helps create a new market and significantly diminishes or transforms an existing one. It's not necessarily destruction. As we saw from Claire's talk, it can create whole new industries, new possibilities, new jobs, new sectors, new infrastructure. And understanding that's really important. Because history is littered with kind of disruptive technology. The horse was disrupted by the car. The ice trade was disrupted by the refrigerator. And you don't really talk about that now in bad terms. You're thinking about it in the possibilities it created. So hopefully today I'm going to try and lay out a little bit of a blueprint for you to think about of how to analyze and, importantly, anticipate disruption. And the first pillar is really around cost curves. I'm sure many of you have seen these before. So we know technology cost curves fall fast and at exponential rates. And we consistently see this dramatic improvement across a lot of different technologies. I would say the most famous one is usually Moore's law, which tells us that for the same dollar, computing power has doubled every 2 years for decades. And I think a couple of takeaways is the idea that these all fall at different rates, right? And that makes it quite difficult to keep up with them as underlying technologies. And then the other point is about biotechnology, which I've kind of illustrated with the cost of the genome, which is actually falling faster than Moore's law. So it's falling at an incredible rate. So, for example, I think one sequence cost $300 million in 1999, and today it's under $1,000. And then the next point is around technological convergence. So it's really that convergence of these technologies coming down in cost that acts as this common catalyst to make disruptions possible. They enable products, businesses, and services with certain functionalities just at a cost like not available before. So there are loads of examples of these products out there, but I wanted to highlight the first electric refrigerator, invented in 1913, of course, the first car, and then the first iPhone. And it's of no kind of coincidence that Apple and Google came out with the first smartphone in the same year. It was actually because the underlying technology was at a certain cost and certain capability that it just hadn't been at before. And something to be aware of, these technologies continue to get better. So they improve in cost and also get better. So their capabilities improve, and of course, 100 years later, the car and the refrigerator look very different. The iPhone maybe less so, but if you put in our hands an iPhone from 2007, we probably would be shocked and horrid about how terrible it was. But at the time, it was incredible, right? Now, in terms of biotech, and what we're thinking about here is, in our report, we really focus in on the idea of a very disruptive technology called precision fermentation. So the middle microorganism is MAX, as Claire talked about in the previous presentation. And that's a really cool technology that we think is going to be really disruptive for a few reasons. So it allows us to harness these microorganisms as mini biological factories to produce any molecule at high speed or volume. So you can select a microorganism, usually a yeast or bacteria, and then program it to produce a desired output, which is usually a protein, all while consuming simple inputs. I think the key thing to be aware of is that you are programming the microbe to produce any specific protein. And most of us hear the word protein and think protein-rich foods like meat and eggs, and yes, they're very important and abundant in food, but proteins are everywhere and in everything. There are so many different types of proteins that we actually don't know the true number globally. And their importance really stems from their kind of varied functions, so we don't necessarily think about those proteins performing functions as enzymes in washing powder or in shampoo or going into materials like leather or silk or wool. And this technology theoretically means we're going to have access to any protein. So not just those proteins we consume and extract from today, which are dictated by that small subset of plants and animals we domesticated thousands of years ago, but actually we're going to be able to create any protein at speed and volume. And that number of proteins is infinite. So we're going to be able to design proteins for the purpose we need. This is going to unlock huge possibilities in terms of biodesign. And in fact, it won't just stop at protein, right? Once it's cheap enough, no protein or any molecule is safe. So companies are already realizing this with startups in areas of things like palm oil, coffee, bricks, or even indigo dye. Now, how did precision fermentation come about? I wouldn't say it's really a deep tech. Maybe it was 40 years ago, but it's actually 40 years old. And that's a really important point about technology. They can be around for a long time, but as I said, they keep improving, getting better, getting cheaper. And it came about actually because insulin used to be extracted from the pancreas of pigs and cows, but in the 1970s, there was a crisis in the US. So the rising number of diabetics meant they thought demand just would simply exceed supply, and that was because it takes 10,000 pounds of pancreas to make just 1 pound of insulin, and that's 23,500 animals. So they simply thought they didn't have enough animals. But technology was on hand. So in 1978, Genentech programmed a microorganism to produce a human insulin, Humulin. It was more expensive to start, but its performance was immediately superior. Disruption was very rapid and followed an S-curve, reaching more than 95% adoption in just 13 years. So we went from a limited supply of animal insulin to an unlimited supply of human insulin. And this technology has actually improved further, and in fact, we've seen Humulin itself be disrupted by other kind of human analog insulins that perform better in the body. And this segue brings us back to another pillar of how we think about disruption, which is the idea of, we see a lot of linear projections for technologies, but no technology in history has ever been adopted in a linear fashion. Technology gets adopted as S-curves. So this chart shows a lot of examples. I'm sure some of you are really familiar with them. It comes from Our World in Data. I want to just highlight a couple of takeaways, and that first, that adoption can happen seemingly incredibly slowly before reaching the critical mass, or tipping point. And before kind of growing and then slowing down again. And second, S-curve adoption is generally accelerating. So what at the turn of the century, adoption kind of took decades, now it's happening in months or years or even months. And I would say as well that even today, mainstream analysts continue to fail to see kind of S-curve disruption happening. So this chart is actually from the IEA, so it's the 20-year forecast of photovoltaic additions. They have been predicting every year they've had to up their estimates for the next year because it's going along an S-curve, and they just haven't kind of accepted that yet. Their forecasts continue to be linear. And that has implications as well on the downside. So, for example, in the coal in the US, the IE's forecasters seem to be kind of desperately hoping for a long time that coal would continue to grow, but they've had to, again, take their estimates down every single year. It's getting a little bit closer now to what it was, but it's still kind of down. And S-curve adoption is not just limited to technology. I would say ingredients see it here. So this is my favorite example, which is citric acid in the US. So at the start of the 20th century, citric acid actually was produced from unripe citrus fruit, which contain about 10% citric acid. So if you look at the back of a packet of a lot of food, you'll see citric acid in there. It's a big kind of preservative. But high prices following World War I actually led Pfizer to develop a new fermentation-based production method. It's the same molecule as found in fruit, and in just that first year of the industrial-sized fermenter opening, production of citric acid using fermentation technology outpaced that from lemons and limes and accounted for more than 50% of the world's supply. So today, that was a fast B2B-driven technology disruption. Today, more than 99% of the 1.6 million tons is actually produced every year and by fermentation, and of course, it led to one of the world's largest companies, Pfizer, off the back of that technology. And then the final pillar of our framework is really about the idea of business model innovation. This is something that's easier to illustrate, I think, in today's world, post kind of iPhone, because we now have a kind of the idea of an app, which is not something that existed like 15, 20 years ago. But now you can see that things like everything can be on demand. So I've put Uber here, but of course it's Bolt, as I found when I got out of the plane. It's Bolt, but this is an example of how New York taxi rides, it's now like 85% come from ride-sharing apps as opposed to kind of traditional taxis. You can see the big spike there from COVID, by the way. And then, you know, it just shows, again, how kind of things can change. And you can see this business models completely change and new businesses off the back of those business models. So everything from films and TV, music, have all been available at a touch of a button due to that technological convergence that resulted in a smartphone. And food is going to be no different. So this is usually something that's a little bit harder for people to grasp, which is the idea that it's going to be a much more profound disruption to food than just about production. There's a complete business model transformation that's going to come from a load of other technologies as well. And we call it food as software, but how we design, develop, produce, distribute food is going to change and is already changing. You know, companies leading this are not necessarily the incumbent companies there, the biotech and information tech companies behind the scenes. So just as it was Apple and Google who disrupted the mobile phone industry, disruption often comes from outside the traditional industry. And we're already seeing this. We're seeing dark kitchens, cloud kitchens, to food delivery is all starting to change and move into this different model. So, for example, one company is this company around design is called Endless West, and they actually are harnessing technology to redesign food from the molecular level up. So they're recreating the molecular makeup of the finest aged whiskies using plants and precision fermentation, right? So their products are completely biochemically the same, and they've actually recently extended their range to include sake and I think some really high-level quality wine. So, you know, it's really interesting how we're starting to see there's a whole change in how we're even creating food. So how is this actually going to disrupt the cow? So I think this is a really important chart. And this is about how insulin really marked that first example, and since then the technology has continued to improve and come down in cost. So we've kind of come down that cost curve, crossed new critical thresholds, opening up sets of new products through pharmaceuticals, enzymes, flavors, and fragrances. Today, I would say we're probably cost competitive with cosmetics and some materials, with production coming in under $100 per ton. And this is opening, again, up new market opportunities and entry points that we're seeing today. So what kind of markets are being opened up? So I would say there's three kind of main subsets, which is products we can't extract from nature. So like human proteins. So, you know, collagen, for example, is actually the most abundant protein in the world. In mammals, it accounts for 1/3 of our protein content. Now, a company called Gelta are actually producing human analog collagens for the beauty industry, which makes perfect sense. You'd want to put human collagen on your face or eat it as a food, an extra food supplement. It's better for you. In fact, they found that some studies show that it could reverse sun damage. So, it kind of shows, again, how incredible this could be. And then the other one is proteins that are too expensive to extract. So we see a lot of these on the market. They're often called plant natural products. It's when the kind of active ingredient is a very small part of the plant. So flavors and fragrances, things like indigo, stevia, cannabinoids, etc. And then the third one is the idea of proteins from perhaps extinct plants and animals, or proteins that simply don't exist yet. So Geltor actually took collagen from mammoths, and they looked at the DNA, did produce the collagen from a mammoth, and then applied it to make gummy bears. I mean, that was a bit of a PR stunt, but it kind of shows you things you could do with these kind of technologies. And all these products are really vital in bringing the cost curve down for precision fermentation and improving capabilities and creating a market. So in 2019 at RethinkX, we made quite a big forecast by 2025, estimating the cost to produce a kilo of protein would be about 10 kilos, and by 2030, 2 kilos. I would say, having worked with these companies at Synthesis, we're a little bit off that, sadly. It's probably more like 40 to 50 at the moment. It's a bit limited by scale-up, so I'm really happy to see Claire's work going on there. But it's really a scale-up and capital problem rather than a technology problem. And the really interesting thing starts to happen when we reach that 10 kilos per ton. That's when precision fermentation becomes cost competitive with animal proteins. And what kind of animal proteins? Well, I think the biggest one is dairy proteins like casein and whey. So this is a company called Perfect Day, and they're actually already doing this for milk protein. So they're selecting that microorganism, a fungus, programming it to produce a key dairy protein, whey, and then mixing that with other ingredients to make perfect animal-free ice cream. And in fact, they just announced milk as well with a fraction of the resources. So the ability to make these specific, identical proteins is a real game changer, and where precision fermentation and plant-based products differ. So you're making that exact same protein in precision fermentation. So theoretically, you're making what is scarce no longer scarce. And this disruption is not a one-for-one disruption. We won't need to make a whole pint of milk with this technology. Milk and ice cream, for example, are just 3% protein. So you just need that 3% from precision fermentation mixed with water, fat, and sugar, and you have a kind of modern milk. And that highlights how important it is on a B2B level. Because that's quite important when we think about where decisions are made around food. If we take a dairy ingredient product like a frozen pizza in the US, there's about $6 billion market of frozen pizzas in 2022. Whey and casein become that key molecule. So DiGiorno's partner with Nestle, for example, to access their mozzarella. Now, Nestle don't need to buy their dairy from the cows, but can go straight to Perfect Day. Supply will be cheaper, less volatile, and on-site, and highlights a key difference about where consumer decisions are made versus business decisions. And the traditional dairy industry are incredibly concerned. This is because, unlike plant-based alternatives, it does taste like dairy, because it is dairy. And in the US, this B2B market is huge. It's about 35% of the total dairy market actually ends up being used as an ingredient. So if you think ingredients, you think cheese on a store-bought pizza or lasagna, or used in food service or restaurants. And as you probably know, food is an incredibly segmented and diverse market. So I wanted to take an example of a product which could be particularly susceptible to disruption. So in the US, the cheese market in itself is worth about $50 billion. Of this, about 35% is sold as mozzarella, and 25% of that ends up on pizzas. So in the US, 10% of cheese is eaten on pizzas, which is an incredible statistic in itself. So most pizzas, 10% of US cheese, most pizzas, in fact, more than 80% are actually sold B2B through food service or pre-prepared food. So we know that these are very susceptible categories to disruption. So it's easy to see how precision fermentation mozzarella could be a big seller, because as a consumer, you're not making that decision, the business is. So as long as it's cheaper and better, then it's a very easy decision for a company to make. So I'm sure you're thinking, what about the meat? Or maybe not, or the rest of the cow. And I'd also say that the animal-free burger has also evolved because of technology. And it's important to know that ground beef, for example, represents about 50% of sales for beef. So we've come a long way from the veggie burgers of old, the kind of Linda McCartney's. So I would say the last 10 years, we've seen a huge change as data has become involved, and we've seen like plant-based burgers really trying to mimic the kind of like the taste of meat. And the innovation doesn't stop there. We actually saw the Impossible Burger come out, and that involves precision fermented heme. So they've used precision fermentation to produce blood to make it taste bloody. And then, of course, as you go on from there, what are we going to see in the future? Cultivated meat, perhaps, which is in itself enabled by precision fermentation. For cultivated meat, you need to have kind of key proteins, and often a way to access that is through precision fermentation. But also other technologies like 3D printing, we've seen companies coming out in the market as well. And then in the future, we don't know what's going to happen. So we've talked a lot about these kind of entry products across the whole cow, so kind of all chipping away at various products. And I think when we think about adoption, we think about the point when the feedback loops start to kick in and the new system grows, where the old system doesn't just decline, it implodes as revenues fall, margins contract, investment plummets in a kind of vicious cycle. So we call this the vicious and virtuous cycle when as this happens, and these feedback loops are really pivotal in understanding that, say, consumer preferences and regulations are not constants in this system. And we don't need to be able to make a steak, for example. And this is the idea of market trauma, and it's kind of the disproportionate, swift, nonlinear financial impact. And it comes from the fallacy that it can take years or decades to reach a substantial market share and have an impact. And investors think about this a lot. It's something we thought about a lot at Synthesis. But the reality is technologies can disrupt the economics of an incumbent industry way before they have a really significant market share. So that means small changes can have an impact. So one of the examples is the coal industry, where we saw kind of the top 4 coal producers in the US fall precipitously as I think investors started to realize that renewable technology was here and it was growing. And I would say that the dairy industry in particular is really susceptible to this because essentially, there's a lot of dairy processors that operate on very thin margins and are really susceptible to small changes in prices. We saw that in 2019 when a couple of dairy processors in the US went bust because of prolonged periods of price decreases. And this is what precision fermentation is, right? It's a 10-fold improvement in efficiency. It's an order of magnitude, and that will translate to cost. So the cow will simply be unable to compete. So we forecast precision fermentation and its enabled industries will grow rapidly, and by 2040, industrial cattle will be more or less obsolete in the US. And I appreciate my presentation has been so far very focused on how this disruption will take hold in the most developed countries, but if I have convinced you in any way, maybe not, maybe we can talk about later that it's inevitable, the implications of this systemic change are really quite profound, and we're going to have ripple effects across many sectors and geographies, so businesses, the economy, geopolitics, to the environment, to investment, and I don't really have time to highlight everything. The one thing I do want to talk a little bit about is land, and how that kind of this food as software. I think the idea that we're going to move from this centralized production hub system to one where it's decentralized, localized system of production, and that's going to be quite a profound change. And also comes with significantly less land needed, especially in the US, to feed animals. So land's not that only area, of course, things like reductions in water, greenhouse gases, land use. As I said, I think the cow's going to have an existential crisis. What's its purpose? But of course, there's second-order impacts from lower waste, food contamination, health, etc. as well. And the other point that I really wanted to mention, I think Claire did a great job of talking about this a little bit, is the idea of like where we are today versus the future. And I think, kind of crossing this, valley of despair, chasm of chaos, whatever, the name is given. And that's kind of where we are. And we definitely see kind of 5 key factors to this. But this is the point where the brakes to adoption are way outweighing the accelerators. Consumer adoption is being driven by social or environmental reasons rather than by cost and taste. So we always say like a rational consumer, would they eat that? A meat-eating consumer, would you switch to eat that product because it tastes just good as, it's convenient as? And there are other issues, of course, regulation and legislation was one, as Claire talked about. This is a whole new industry we're trying to build up. Infrastructure has to be built up, regulatory landscape navigated. Can you even scale it up? What are the feedstocks going to be? What are the systems going to be? Where will the energy come from? What are we going to even label this stuff? What's the nutritional profile? And this is something that comes along with a lot of deep tech. Like, this is not just specific to food tech. And this is where, as I said, the brakes to those adoptions really work to outweigh those accelerators. But there is a point where actually that can flip, and you see, or I wanted to focus in on a couple, actually. I've got 30 seconds, so I'll go through these, which is around regulation. So in the US, we saw a couple of key moments around FDA granting kind of regulatory approval to cultivated meat in the US. And this can be a trigger to other jurisdictions. So it's probably going to be Singapore, Israel, China. And the other one is, which I think Claire did a much better job of talking about, is the government support. I do think from my work on electric vehicles, this is a really, really, really vital area. And once you see so for example, with electric vehicles, we saw a lot of kind of investment coming in, and that really kind of helped accelerate the technology. And then that helps kind of the system flip. And what happens when the system flips? So what used to be brakes become accelerators. And this is true of any S-curve, right? So consumers are fully bought in. Products are better and cheaper in every way. The issues with the technology in the early days have gone. Regulation is easier and broader, bringing new products to market faster. Governments are bought in. What may have been seen as politically sensitive, like a meat tax, perhaps hasn't got the same kind of association with it. And capacity is growing exponentially. And infrastructure investment is accelerating, and technology is fully de-risked. So education and training is ramping up in support of that new industry. And that is what leads to that exponential growth in the new system. So just in final, our choices matter: investment choices, business choices, consumer choices, and policy choices. And they're going to what ultimately determines the nature of this kind of modern food system. And this includes whether or not it will be a positive for climate stability, for example. So it's not a transition, but it is a disruption not happening because of climate, but it's happening because of technology. And that's important to understand. In our view, it's really underlined by technology. You can see more of our work around Rethink X on other sectors as well, and thank you so much.